Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Travis Madsen. I'm the Transportation Program Director at SWEEP. Let's give folks another minute or so to join, and then we'll get started. So sit tight for just a minute or two. Thanks. All right. It's a minute after the hour. Let's get started. Thank you all for joining. My name is Travis Madsen. I am the Transportation Program Director at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. I'm joined today by Rebecca Saraboff from the Electrification Coalition and Glenn Sellers from DNV, who works with PNM on implementing their transportation electrification plan. We're here today to talk a little bit about some of the new tools made available through federal funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to help local governments in particular advance electric vehicle planning and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I think there's a fair number of folks on here from the local government world, but we likely have some other audience members as well. So we're happy to answer any questions that come up. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question that comes up during the course of the presentation, please type your question into the Q&A. And if the panelists know a simple answer off the top of their heads, we can answer it in that Q&A panel, or there will be 20-25 minutes at the end of the presentation for us to go over any questions live. So Tammy, I'm also joined by Tammy Feeblecorn, who's my colleague representing SWEEP in New Mexico. And she's going to be helping us move along the slides. So next slide, Tammy. Here's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give some context about transportation electrification in New Mexico. Then we'll turn to Rebecca, who will talk a little bit more about the resources offered by Electrification Coalition to help local governments in particular advance transportation electrification in their communities. Glenn will talk about his work with PNM and in general about what electric utilities in New Mexico can offer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the tools that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law made available. And then we'll move into question and answers. Next slide, Tammy. Actually, before we get into this, Rebecca and Glenn, will you just take a moment to introduce yourselves?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Saraboff. I'm a senior EV infrastructure associate at the Electrification Coalition, and I'll talk more about who we are and what we do later. I am based out of Washington, D.C., but have loved all of the time that I've spent in New Mexico. So thank you for welcoming me.
Thank you as well, Travis. Glenn Sellers, head of section for DNV here in New Mexico. We do a bunch of work with PNM. Notably for this presentation, we work on their transportation electrification program. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Excellent. And again, I'm Travis Madsen. I run the transportation program at SWEEP. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, but I work with allies and governments across the region in 6 different states. So just to lay the table here, transportation electrification is well underway in New Mexico and across the region. I'm sure you're seeing more and more EVs out on the roads in different parts of the state, and not just light duty passenger vehicles, but also larger buses and trucks as well. Next slide, Tammy. We're currently at about 4% of the light duty market in New Mexico is electric, which is about, I'd say, in the middle of the pack of states nationwide. New Mexico is about 2 years behind Colorado. And if New Mexico sees sales accelerate at the same pace that Colorado's seen, this market share should more than double in the next 2 years. and expected to grow quickly after that, in particular because of some of the financial resources that the Inflation Reduction Act made available, as well as if you look at the newspaper today, EPA has announced a new national vehicle emission standard that I expect is going to push automakers even further towards electrifying all of their models. So we're pretty early in the transition still, but it's accelerating rapidly, and I expect EVs to become the norm in New Mexico within the next 10 or 15 years. Next slide. There's some real benefits that come along with this, which is the reason why SWEEP is advocating for it to happen faster. We did a report a couple of years ago looking at the benefits for the state of electrifying all the light duty vehicles in the state on a pace that's compatible with meeting the state's climate emissions targets. We found that transition is going to save New Mexico drivers on the order of $20 billion through 2050. Part of the reason for that is, as you can see in the figure here, driving on electricity is roughly equivalent to $1 a gallon, whereas the current price for gas in New Mexico is about $3.58. There's also significant savings that happen on maintenance, and the consumer benefits of driving an EV are substantial. There's also benefits in terms of reducing pollution. We estimated the climate value of this transition at about $5 billion, and there's significant public health benefits, reduced respiratory disease, saved lives that we put a $3 billion value on, or actually American Lung Association put a $3 billion value on. The transition is also going to help us get more value out of the investments we've made in our electricity grid by getting more work done with the power plants and power lines that we've already built. And we estimated that that's going to save consumers about $5 billion on their electricity bills, whether they are driving an EV or not, or drive at all. And then lastly, if any of you driven an EV, I think you know that the vehicles offer a lot of additional benefits in terms of they're quiet. They offer a smooth ride, and the performance is better than traditional vehicles. Next slide, Tammy. To unlock these benefits, though, local governments and the state are going to need to invest in building out a charging network sufficient to meet the needs of all the EVs that are going to be on our roads. A big part of that is going to be at private properties, at people's homes, or at fleet hubs owned by businesses. But we'll also need a significant amount of public charging. Based on a report that the International Council for Clean Transportation put out a couple of years ago, we estimate that New Mexico is going to need about 12,000 public charging ports by 2030 to accommodate the expected amount of EVs. I think more than other states, New Mexico has a lot of single-family homes, so the number of public charging ports we'll need, as you can see in this figure on the right, is smaller per EV than in a place with a lot more dense housing. But it's still going to be a pretty significant amount of work to install these charging stations over the next 10 years or so. The report estimates that we're going to need about a third of the total investment going into public DC fast charging, 10% into workplaces, 10% into public level 2s, with the rest of the investment going into private homes and multi-unit dwellings. Next slide. And with that, I'll pass it to Rebecca.
Thanks, Travis. That was a great way to kick us off. Nice to be here with you all today. My name is Rebecca Sarabach. I'm a Senior EV Infrastructure Associate at the Electrification Coalition. The Electrification Coalition is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that is dedicated towards driving the policies and actions that will electrify all modes of transportation to protect economic and national security, public health, and American jobs. We do all of this in partnership with our sister organization, SAFE, and you might have seen pictures or tweets or social media posts from the big conference that we just had a couple of weeks ago that was focused on these issues. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes today talking about federal incentives. I'll first talk about the new CFI, or Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. I'll talk a little bit about some more incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act, and then I'll provide 2 tools to help sort of navigate all of these incentives. Go ahead to the next slide. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law gave us a ton of money to help support public charging nationwide. It gave us NEVI, or the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is formula funds that have gone to 52 jurisdictions to help develop the nation's first public charging network. So that's half or more than half, 2/3 of the money for public charging. And then the other section is CFI. So that's the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program, which we received a notice of funding opportunity for on March 14th. And it's a total of $2.5 billion to support public charging, which is phenomenal. It's not very often that we get a brand new program from the federal government. So we're pretty stoked about this one. A couple notes: the funding is discretionary. The funding, as you can see in this graphic, is sort of divided between 2 separate sub-programs, one being the community program and one being the corridor program. So, in short, the community program is thinking about, adding chargers in places like community centers or libraries or grocery stores, where the corridor program, under CFI, is looking to complement the alternative fuel corridors that the NEVI program is already building out. So, both public charging and both really motivating and a huge opportunity for communities. And the standards can be found on grants.gov or DOT's website, as well as our website. We've got a bunch of tools and resources. And go ahead and flip to the next slide. A couple pieces of information about CFI. Charging and Fueling Infrastructure is a mouthful, so I'll go with CFI from now on. CFI supplements, not supplants, necessary private sector investment. So we're seeing awesome engagement from private sector partners, that goes hand in hand with public charging. It's also meant to complement existing federal programs. It's meant to facilitate broad public access to a national charging and alternative fuel infrastructure network to really accelerate the adoption that Travis was talking about of zero emission vehicles. Of course, it's mission critical that we implement Justice 40 objectives, lower transportation costs, and increase economic opportunity, followed by advancing job quality, workforce development, workforce equity, and of course, reducing greenhouse gas and vehicle-related emissions, which we were really lucky to learn more about today. So some really high-level details, and then I'll be happy to maybe answer some more questions about CFI later or point you in the direction of some resources, or that the $2.5 billion will be awarded over the span of 5 years. So that's until FY 2026. For this upcoming year, there is $700 million available, which is an incredible amount of money. 350 for the community charging to deploy EV charging, and more on public roads or in publicly accessible locations, with a minimum award of $500,000 and a maximum of $15 million. And then the corridor to also deploy public charging, but on these alternative fuel corridors, we've got $350 million with a minimum award of $1 million. And then you'll notice that there is no maximum award, which is great. And again, happy to spend more time later talking about what makes a competitive application. And our friends over at the Joint Office are excited to see applications that are scalable. It can be scaled up or scaled back, because they're looking to deploy as much of this money as quickly as possible. And applications are due May 30th. So that, I think I'll wrap on CFI there, and then just turn to some more IRA incentives on the next slide. I will spend just a minute talking about these because I could talk about them for hours. There are tons of tax credits available, which I'm sure everyone on the webinar has heard lots about, for charging infrastructure, for new EVs, for used EVs, for commercial EVs. It's a really incredible opportunity. And, I might add that with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we have 30 times more money, excluding the tax credits, than we've had before, to, work to spread transportation electrification and to, deploy as quickly as we can. I've listed a few of the relevant federal funding opportunities below, like the electric school bus rebates, EPA's heavy duty truck rebates, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and then the environmental and climate justice block grants. But you might say, if you flip to the next slide, Rebecca, there are so many of these things. How do I keep track of them? And how do I know what's right for me? And I would say, that's great. We have an answer. Back in January, the Electrification Coalition released the EV Funding Finder, which is a user-friendly tool to identify federal transportation electrification funding opportunities. And we created the EV Funding Finder as a result of talking with local governments, and they would ask the question, where is the money and how do I get it? So the Funding Finder capitalizes on this, unprecedented investment in transportation electrification from the federal government, which, like I mentioned earlier, excluding tax credits is 30 times what we've had before, and the Funding Finder supports efficient, effective, and equitable deployment of funds to reach ambitious goals. So if you flip to the next slide, the Funding Finder lowers the barrier to entry to identifying and accessing federal funding opportunities for transportation electrification, and it shows how funding opportunities can be stacked and which alternative routes folks might be able to take to fund projects. And then it also right now provides case studies that show potential use of funds. The link in the QR code should take you there, but I hope that you'll hang on before doing that for just 1 second while I take you through a brief demo of the Funding Finder. So on the next slide, you'll see some screen grabs from the Funding Finder. There are tons of options for who you represent, and I encourage you, if you don't see yourself as a city, a rural area, a school, freight, EV advocates, a business, a nonprofit, an individual, or a state, to get creative and to see, which one of these you resonate with most. On the Funding Finder, you're able to click one of these, and then the next page, which is pictured here, there are a number of what we're calling eligible activities. So that could be anything from purchasing a light duty vehicle or a heavy duty vehicle, or charging infrastructure, or supporting a grid upgrade, planning, workforce development, anything related. We've probably got it. And if you go to the next slide, after you fill out who you are and what you're trying to do, you'll get this image on the left here that right now has a fictional case study. And then on the right, there will be a list of funds that you should be eligible to apply to. And I'll stop right here to say that we're updating the Funding Finder as quickly as new information is available. The information that we have here is the information that's available to the public. And it is, as up to date as everything that's out to the public is. It doesn't have information that is not available to the public, but we're constantly updating it as we learn of new programs. So on the, right side of the screen grab on the left, all of the links are live, and they pull up these examples of the images you see on the right that will tell you a little bit more about the program, list relevant dates, and then also talk about what we call stackability. So that is the EV Funding Finder, which is the first tool that I'm excited to share with you. We're really stoked about it, and we've received hundreds of folks who have used the Funding Finder. And I'll also mention that the case studies that are on the left, this one says Voltland wants to ensure that low income and disadvantaged communities have access to EV charging. We made all of these case studies up to sort of show how folks can combine and stack funds. But we want to replace them with folks who are applying for funds and winning funding. So if this is something that is of interest to you, please let us know. And we're happy to spotlight your wonderful work. And then the last tool that I have to share, in addition to many other tools that are on our website, if you go to the next slide, is the Local Government Playbook, which is a report that we published at the end of last year that contains actions and strategies that local governments can enact now and in the future, including best practices, innovative policy approaches, and lessons from previous public charging deployments. We talk about things you can do today, tomorrow, and next month as it relates to policy action, state and regional planning, stakeholder and community engagement, and site planning. And it's provides sort of a checklist, if you will, if you go to the next slide, of things that folks working in local government can do to champion public charging. So I won't read everything on this slide, but just perhaps give folks a minute to read. So, in addition to these tools, which felt the most relevant to share here today, the Electrification Coalition has a number of other tools and resources that we'll be delighted to share with you. And I thank you for this time, and I'll pass it back over to you, Travis, and I'll be around for questions later.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was excellent. We'll take the questions at the end, so please keep them coming in the Q&A tool at the bottom. And now I'd like to pass it over to Glenn to talk about his work with PNM.
Awesome. Thank you, Travis. And thanks for everybody at Sweep for putting this together. It's a really exciting time, as I'm sure you kind of got the energy from what Rebecca's been talking about. Just an exciting time for transportation and electrification in general. So what I'm going to talk about for the next few slides is going to be a little bit shorter, but it is about utility funding. Like I said, when it rains, it pours. There's a ton of different funding sources available. This is from your utilities, specifically investor-owned utilities within New Mexico, which covers a pretty good majority of the state, at least in terms of accounts and certainly in terms of energy consumption and potential EV charging, as it covers most of the state's metro areas. So like I said, we're all pulling in the same direction, and I'll talk about this in a second, but these funds stack. So this is it's a good time to be putting in electric charging infrastructure, as you have multiple funding sources to work on this. So can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so just a little bit of history. I promise this will be the only one that's a little bit verbose in terms of what you have to read, but it's important to understand this and where this funding comes from. But House Bill 521 came out in 2019 and requires investor-owned utilities to expand their transportation electrification. So investor-owned utilities, that includes PNM, El Paso Electric, and Excel, or Southwestern Public Service. That does not include all of the co-ops within the state, which there's a number of them, but they do cover a minority of the state's consumers, but this only goes to our investor-owned utilities. So as I introduced myself earlier, I work for DNV, and we implement PNM's transportation electrification program. So I can answer questions and give a ton of detail about our work with PNM and how their transportation electrification program works. I'll give some resources towards the end if you are a customer of El Paso Electric or Excel, because they have similar programs. There's some key differences, but they're similar and have similar categories for who qualifies. But specifically for PNM, it's the largest investor-owned utility within New Mexico, and also in turn has the largest transportation electrification program. This program includes incentives for residential and non-residential. We sometimes call that commercial or industrial, and a lot of the sustainability space, but specifically here it's broader than that, so we call it non-residential. Also includes pilot electrical rates, funding for education and outreach, as well as administrative costs for the program implementation, as there's a lot that goes into making sure the incentives get to the right folks. In addition, as I said before, utility funds can stack on other funding sources. So everything you're hearing about NEVI, unless there's specific program terms that says this has to be the sole funding source and you're not allowed to use private funding, whether that's utility funding or elsewhere, these funds can stack. So we're all pulling in the same direction. It's really important to cover as much program cost as you can, and using both federal funding, other funding sources, whether it's private, as well as the funds from your utility if it's investor owned, you can cover a significant portion of your electrification costs. So next slide, please. So specifically for PNM, the broad strokes here: residential, level 2, mass transit, DC fast charging. Those are the big categories. I know our audience here is a lot of local governments, local institutions, state governments, institutions like that. So residential might not be as applicable, but all of these other ones certainly are. You can see that the type of incentive and what helps it qualify is very much tied to what the potential costs are. We all know DC fast charging is significantly more expensive than level 2 charging, and so you get a significantly higher amount of incentive. All these details are also available at ev.pnm.com. That link is later in the slide deck. So you can go there and see what the exact requirements are, what's on the QPL, which stands for qualifying product list, what else you need to do to qualify. But this is basically it. If you're a P&M customer or a customer of a similar investor-owned utility, the qualifications are pretty straightforward. You get the prescribed incentive amount for installing the prescribed qualifying product up to a certain amount. DC fast charging is a good example. You get $25,000 per port times 4. That's up to $100,000 you can get for your business. You need to be a P&M customer and agree to a couple other terms and conditions of the program. But other than that, it's a pretty straightforward program. But like I said, P&M is the largest investor-owned utility in New Mexico, and that's adding up to $6.7 million that P&M has carved out to be giving out to its customers. So next slide. And like I said, our peers, El Paso Electric, Excel Energy, those are the other investor-owned utilities that's covered by House Bill 521. Those links are there. If you're from one of their service territories, you're from Cruces, Roswell, or some of the surrounding communities, you'd be covered by these utilities, and they have similar attributes to their program, but they are smaller, which scales with the service territory and population that P&M covers. But other than that, would be happy to talk to anyone. My contact information is later in the slide deck. I'll put the ev.pnm.com in the chat as well, and look forward to work with some of y'all as this program gets stand up. It's all very new, very exciting, and we're excited to work with all y'all. So thanks.
Thanks, Glenn. I just want to mention a couple of additional resources available to local governments that folks might not be completely aware of yet, that don't involve you don't have to apply for a grant to get these sources of money. They're already things that communities are familiar with through their work on transportation infrastructure. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law expanded the eligible uses of the regular money that local governments get for roads and bridges and whatnot, to include EV planning, EV workforce development, public charging, and public transit, both investments in capital facilities and charging infrastructure. So this chart here, the stars in the tables indicate the additional flexibility that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law created. So for example, if you were a local government and you wanted to find some money to pay for a community EV infrastructure plan, that's something that you could use metropolitan planning dollars for, or surface transportation block grant dollars for. And then the table also shows that the National Highway Performance Program, surface transportation block grants, and also CMAQ for the parts of the state that are in non-attainment zones for criteria air pollution. All of those funds are also available for use in either workforce development or installing charging infrastructure for the public or for transit agencies. So these are monies that your community already has access to. You don't have to apply for a grant to get these, but there are some trade-offs in the next slide that I'm sure you're all well aware of, and I'll just mention them here just to make sure that obviously there's a lot of different things you could use this money for. So any EV project would be in competition for other eligible uses of the funds, and your community would have to decide that the EV projects were a priority in order to allocate this money towards transportation electrification. A couple other criteria which you're likely familiar with from how these programs work for any other kind of transportation infrastructure investment. Typically, you need a local match of 20%. I think some of the supplemental sources of money, like the utility money, in some cases can stack there. Other requirements you have to comply with are the Davis-Bacon and Buy America rules. And then it's important when embarking on one of these projects, again, to look at how different funding sources can stack. So one of the first conversations should be with whatever utility, whether it's an investor-owned utility or a co-op utility that provides electricity in your region. that should be one of the first folks you reach out to, and they can help identify different opportunities to stack funding to make the project work. There's some additional money that is in the federal laws that can support EV charging investments, and I'll just mention them briefly here. So the federal government offers a transportation infrastructure innovation and financing credit assistance program that would typically be for something that would be really big, like $50 million or more. So I'm guessing the state would probably be the most likely player that would use that. Energy efficiency and conservation block grants, which there's some formula money going out on that this year, and then later the state will be distributing competitive grants to smaller local governments. That money is usable for transportation electrification. And then lastly, there's a special program called the Federal Lands and Tribal Transportation Program that's just for tribal governments. So next slide, Tammy. I think with that, we'll move to Q&A. So if any of you have questions, put them in the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll dive in on some of the questions that are here in the chat and answer them live. And then there were some additional questions that came in via email before the webinar that we can take a crack at as well. I'll start with the first one I see here in the open section, which, Tammy, this one might be something that you would know more about, possibly. Question from Charles Bennett. Outside of metro areas, New Mexico has telecom challenges that hinder retail public charging. Or maybe Glenn, you might know more about this. Has there been any discussion regarding resolving this issue?
We need to clarify exactly what telecom challenges that they're referring to. But Charles, it's a great question because there certainly is some constraint. If we're talking about grid constraint, that's something that is actively being addressed on a much broader scale than just transportation electrification. As you know, that it's clear that we need a lot more electrical capacity in order to keep up with the demand that transportation electrification and electrification of many other sectors is going to provide. But that's not something that's specifically within the scope of transportation electrification itself, but it's a major factor that's driving it. So it's certainly being handled at a very high level and by a ton of different people, but it's a real challenge. So it's good to identify, Charles.
I would just add to that that in the same year that HB 521 was passed, there was also a grid modernization piece of legislation, and that resulted in a working group that is working, meeting regularly and working on grid modernization. And so that question and that concern has been heard loudly, and there is a large group of folks working on that at the state level.
I suppose one other thing to add is I have seen, not New Mexico, but in other states, conversations happening between charging infrastructure providers and like the parts of the state government that are using the broadband. There's money in the infrastructure law for expanding broadband access, and there's some overlap with these things. So if that's not happening in New Mexico yet, charging infrastructure providers should reach out to the office that's handling the broadband money.
That is for sure, just to be clear. And we also just passed a constitutional amendment to allow federal or state funds to be used for essential household services. And the impetus for that was broadband accessibility in rural New Mexico.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, Glenn. Rebecca, maybe you can take the next one out loud.
Yeah, sure. I just sent the answer in the chat, but I'm totally happy to talk a little bit more about it, about what needs to be included in CFI applications. So I just sent the link to the EC's CFI Tools and Resources Hub in the chat, and that will go through the nitty gritty of, who am I and where do I, need to be. And I encourage everyone, as you're reading through that, if you have questions or want support, please reach out and we're happy to help. But I'll just take a couple minutes here to share top priorities that folks are looking for in applications. You know, as we understand it, we are not the ones reading applications, but via our conversations, we know that the top priority for CFI applications is safety, and how applications either support current safety measures or make communities safer. We know that a main priority is equity, and how applications sort of include these Justice 40 initiatives, and how they work to advance things like local workforce and supporting economic development within communities. And then finally, it's mission critical that applications are scalable, so that awards can be given as, you know, they're able to be deployed. You know, as many folks, we want as many folks to be able to get awards as possible. So the more scalable your application, the more opportunities you're given. So happy to answer more specific questions as they come up. And I encourage you to look on our website. We have tons more information, and then also a decision tree that sort of lays out everything that you need in an application.
Let's go to Alex Brookerson's question. What are the biggest hurdles to putting charging stations on street corners similar to current gas stations? Is working with convenience stores possible? Rebecca, do you want to take a shot at that one? And then Glenn, if you have anything to add.
Sure, I can kick it off. Something that we like to say a lot at the Electrification Coalition is that we can't compare gas stations to EV charging stations. It's like comparing apples to oranges. They're both fruit, but they're both totally, you know, different entities that need different solutions. But, you know, all that said, there are definitely infrastructure related problems that lie with, you know, putting gas station or putting, you know, charging stations on street corners similar to gas stations. We need to build an entirely different infrastructure that requires a lot of different folks getting on board, that requires a ton of different permitting. But in a, you know, positive turn of events, we're seeing a lot of convenience stores like Wawa, or of course now I'm blanking on the specific names, but partner with entities like EVgo, or partner with entities like Electrify America to install charging stations throughout all of their convenience stores. So just as it is, you know, hard and challenging as it relates to infrastructure, there are a lot of folks that are taking on the challenge and taking advantage of these incentives and private investment too to make it happen.
Travis, if I could just add to that, you know, New Mexico got quite a bit of money from the VW settlement, and a lot of it, we did the maximum amount for infrastructure, and very many of those awards were partnerships with ALSUPs. And so we are going to see those kinds of fueling locations coexisting with charging locations in New Mexico.
Yeah, and I suppose I would add, if you're a local government and you identify in your infrastructure plan that you want a charging station in a certain location, and a convenience store is a likely potential site host, reach out to the convenience store and talk to them about the potential of siting a charging infrastructure on their property. All right. I actually don't know the answer to this question. From Paul David, will the tribal grant program fund charging stations located in towns adjacent to but not on the reservation? Rebecca, do you know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer, but I can try and put you in touch with somebody who would know the answer.
Yeah, I can't even guess, really. We can follow up afterwards about that. A question from Steffi Weisberg: how much of New Mexico has the potential for lamppost charging? Glenn, do you have any thoughts about that?
I do not. It would depend on the infrastructure, kind of like the last question we're discussing, where it's really difficult to give a categorical answer. Like Rebecca was talking about for, you know, convenience stores, lamppost charging could certainly be, you know, a really big opportunity, but it's contingent upon the local infrastructure and then even down to the particular lamppost. There's certainly opportunity there, but it's going to vary pretty widely by municipality, and even parts of municipalities whether or not it's viable. So.
And I think, Glenn, going off of what you said, this is a good moment to elevate entities like mobile EV charging. Maybe it's not in the cards to, lay conduit. Eventually, it will need to be in the cards to lay conduit in the ground, but maybe right now it's not in the cards to do that. And there are plenty of solutions like mobile charging or solar charging that will allow folks to charge their cars without, going through what needs to happen to get them in the ground.
Mike Kloppel asks, can municipalities receive funding for EV stations if they convert some of their vehicles to EVs? Answer to that is yes. And Rebecca, maybe you have some more to say there.
Yeah, short answer to your question is yes. A lot of the funds that municipalities, and you can sort of check these out on the EV funding finder, a lot of the funds, in addition to including what we like to call allocations for vehicles, will also contain sort of allocations for operations and maintenance, for related service equipment, for workforce development. So the short answer to your question is yes.
And Mike, if you work for a local government and you'd like to explore how to do that, Sweep would be happy to talk to you about that, and I'm sure Rebecca would be as well.
Definitely.
Okay, turning to some of the questions we got via email. Is there particular information targeting school districts that could help move the needle in terms of decisions to electrify bus fleets? Does anyone want to weigh in on that?
I can start. Or for PNM specifically, there's a mass transit program that specifically has charging infrastructure for, as it sounds, mass transit. So from the utility side, absolutely, if you're a PNM customer, there is, and the other investor-owned utilities may have something similar, but for all PNM customers, that's a definite yes. So.
Okay. Let's see here. Another question. We got a question from local government that's interested in funding county-owned solar power projects coupled with county fleet electrification. So the question is, I guess, what are there funding sources available through these federal laws that would be usable for that? And then also, what do you see as the county role in encouraging private sector development of EV charging infrastructure? Rebecca, do you want to start in on that one, or?
Yeah, I can start with the second one. I don't have too much familiarity with solar, but I really like that second question because it brings up another priority in all of these applications, and that is partnerships. County roles, private industry roles is it's really essential that everyone collaborates to understand what the specific community need is. So include community-based organizations in there, and think about how can we ensure that as we're deploying these projects, it's what communities are looking for, it's equitable, it's efficient, and it's effective. So I think that the role of the two is to pull together different perspective and ensure that these things being charging deployment are effective, efficient, and equitable.
I guess I would add to that, if I were a county, the first thing I would do is come up with a EV charging infrastructure plan. Using one of the funding sources mentioned in here, and case studies of other governments doing this that Electrification Coalition has. You're likely to find there's a bunch of potential partners you'll need to talk to, including utilities and then property owners who might own property in places that would be optimal for installing an EV charger. Charles asks, is there help for a county to develop an EV plan? How would they start?
Do you want to kick that one off, Travis?
I think, why don't you start?
Yes, I think that the answer to that question is yes, there is help for a county to develop an EV plan. I think there are so many different places to start. I'm inclined to say talking to your state Department of Transportation or your state Department of Energy, whomever is sort of coordinating your state, NEVI plans, but then also there are tons of advocates like SWEEP, like the Electrification Coalition, like many others on this call who are excited to provide direct technical support.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess I would just add to that. If you want to see an example of what one of these looks like, I'd be happy to send some to you. And then, if you get to the point where you want to fund one for your own county, I can help connect you to consultants who could provide technical assistance in actually executing the projects, or I can answer questions as they come up. Doug Sharp asks, how long do you think it will take for the money to flow after the May 30th application deadline? I assume what we're talking about here is the NEVI competitive grant program.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer, but I know that it's a big priority from folks over at the joint office. So I know that, they're on top of it and ready to get going. So while I don't have a date, know that it is top of mind for many folks.
All right. Glenn, maybe you could take this one. Do we have enough power generation capacity to match current and future EV charging demand? Can we anticipate changes to the price of electricity as a result?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. The answer for full EV adoption, 100% of every single electric vehicle or every single current vehicle being transitioned from internal combustion to electric in America is no. Yeah, there is not current demand or current generation capacity, especially during peak hours. You might be able to, in certain markets, say if everybody charged, that's why there's time of use rates, but there might be possible in certain markets. Well, if everybody, 100% of people all charge their car at 2 a.m, there would be current generation capacity, but that's not how human behavior works. So the answer is no on a kind of broad basis, but it's possible right now for a significant proportion of internal combustion engines to move over to EV. And there's also a significant amount of generation capacity being built out, especially with renewables in the United States right now. So currently, short answer is no in a lot of instances, but there's a lot of work being done to make sure that is the case as electrification grows and grows.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that the utility regulators are constantly keeping an eye on utility resource plans and making sure that there's enough capacity to meet demand for electricity, not just for EVs, but for all things. And the process we're going through with transportation electrification is not all that different to previous times in history, like, for example, when we rolled out air conditioners, when we're adding a lot of new demand to the power system. And I'm confident that the utilities and the regulators are going to maintain a reliable supply of electricity. And then also on the prices, as I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, I think this is actually going to lower the electricity rates versus what they would otherwise be, because we're going to get more useful work done out of the investments we're making in the electricity system. Because if you think about it right now, like a lot of people are not doing a lot of things at night, and typically that's when you charge your EV, and it can use spare capacity on the grid. And there's a consumer value to that we estimated at $5 billion for people in New Mexico over the next 30 years, just from electrifying light duty vehicles. Let's see here. There was another question that, Glenn, I think this one is for you. A specific question about what's the are you aware of any activity around investing in public EV charging in Rio Rancho or Sandoval County?
Yeah, there are some efforts, but in order to protect our customers, infrastructure projects, infrastructure information, it's not something we'll share publicly. But for folks that are interested in that, I welcome you to talk to me offline, and we could see if our interests align and potentially collaborate on that sort of thing. But can't confirm or deny any particular projects by Rio Rancho, Sandoval County, or any other P&M customer.
Fair. Another one for you, Glenn. We heard from the New Mexico Automotive Dealers Association. They're interested in learning what funding opportunities for EV charging infrastructure exist at private businesses like car dealerships.
Yeah, glad to see that question. As all the transportation electrification programs that investor-owned utilities, especially P&Ms, are great fits for private entities, including dealerships. And we're already starting to see some work with some of them. Once again, can't share particular project details, especially if they haven't come to fruition yet. But a significant proportion of the commercial portfolio of the transportation electrification programs are perfect fits for dealerships. There's workplace and fleet level 2 charging for whether that's the cars you loan out for the day or just the fleet cars for the work your dealership does. There's public DC fast charging if you're on transportation corridor, just want to provide that benefit to your customers or potentially monetize that opportunity. And those are some of the big ones. Certainly there's some parts of it that wouldn't apply, like multifamily level 2, but workplace fleet, public level 2, public DC fast charging would all be fantastic fits for dealership. But we're already starting to see some activity for the transportation electrification program. So.
And then I think there's one final question, and then if anyone else would like to add additional questions to the Q&A, feel free. I think the last question I have on my plate here is, it's less about the public EV charging, and it's more about how to support drivers without access to home charging. Rebecca or Glenn, do you have any thoughts about what local governments can do to help make sure that people who live in apartment buildings and whatnot can get access to the convenience of being able to charge at home overnight?
Yeah, Travis, this is a great question. I think I sort of partially answered it in the Q&A earlier. This is one of the things that we're really excited for about CFI, the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, is that all of the chargers have to be publicly accessible. And I think, as we see this network of 50,000 chargers across the United States pop up, there will be more and more access for folks who don't have access to home charging to charge their cars. And I think that, this question also goes to show that we still have a lot of work to do within our communities to think about, where can we best place chargers where people go to most and where people will use them most. So the answer is figure out where people are going and try and put charging stations there. That's the really high up answer. But low to the ground is that we have more work to do. And it's an awesome time to do it because it's super incentivized.
To add on to that, the utility transportation electrification programs also specifically have carve-outs, including P&Ms for multifamily level 2 charging. So that's multiple avenues for funding available for folks that are trying to make sure that renters have access to charging too, because that's a pretty significant proportion of folks within New Mexico are multifamily housing. So that was thought of ahead when this was filed in for each utility's transportation electrification program, and those funds are available. So.
Travis, I would just quickly add that if you're a local government entity that is interested in making sure that people have access to their, overnight charging, there are things like sweep study about EV ready building codes, where we could really start to impact the number of multifamily units that have access. And then there's also the potential of making some incentive programs around that for multifamily unit owners.
Good point, Tammy. If any local governments want help with EV ready building codes, SWEEP is here. A couple more questions coming up. I think we have time for one or maybe two more of these. So I'll take the Ormond Derek question, who asks, do federal funding programs allow for utilities to use funds to incorporate demand response programs or EV energy storage into their EV programs? And I guess I don't know that answer to that 100% for sure, but I think, for sure, if you're looking at installing EV charging equipment that contains battery storage as an integrated component, for sure you can use federal funding for those sorts of things. Other than that, I think the utilities have access to some funds through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that they might be able to use for demand response. But Glenn, you might know more about that end of things.
Yeah, for utility funding with respect to electric vehicle charging that has energy storage components to it, there's nothing that precludes that, but it would have to be on a qualifying product list. But that's currently being developed, so that's stay tuned. At least for PNM, I'm certain that other comparable utilities, especially around the country, have already qualified such equipment. But the key would be that if the funding source is for electric vehicle charging equipment, it could not be used for just storage. It would have to be a combination of equipment. But there is equipment available on the market today that meets those requirements. So you could have EV charging that also has battery component to it and get funding that meets those requirements. So.
And then just real quickly on this last question from Steffi Weisbert about how the federal EV tax credit is going to work with transferring to dealers, which is something that can start in 2024. Will dealers have to verify customer income? And I don't actually know the answer to that question. Rebecca's asked her colleagues at Electrification Coalition if they know, and we'll get back to you. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank all of the speakers, Rebecca and Glenn and Tammy, for all the excellent information you presented today and the help that you provided as well. I'd like to thank all of you who attended the webinar. If there's any additional questions that you'd like to talk to us about, our contact information is on the last slide of the presentation. We'll be sending that around after the presentation is done. And we look forward to working with all of you to accelerate transportation electrification. Thank you so much.